2,000 years ago, before there was a Walgreens on every corner, before there were prescription pads or penicillin, people still got infections. Cuts got dirty, wounds festered, skin broke down, and people died from things we now treat in an afternoon. But here is what most history books leave out. They did not simply suffer and wait. They had something. Something that grew wild in the rocky hillsides of ancient Israel. Something so common that nobody thought twice about picking it. Something that showed up not once, not twice, but dozens of times across the oldest written records we have. For generations, scholars read those references and assumed they were purely spiritual, symbolic, religious ritual, and nothing more. Then a group of researchers decided to stop assuming. They brought this plant into a modern laboratory. They ran the tests. They looked at the data, and what they found stopped them cold. Because the people who lived in the time of Jesus were not using this plant by accident. They knew exactly what it did. So why does almost nobody talk about this today? Let us go back to the world of the ancient Middle East. Picture the landscape: dry hills, stone walls baking under the sun, small villages where everyone knew their neighbors, where a family's survival often depended on what they could grow or gather nearby. In that world, a cut that got infected was not a minor inconvenience. It could take your life within days. Skin diseases were terrifying because nobody understood what caused them. A fever from a wound gone bad was often a death sentence. The plant that people turned to in those moments was called hyssop. In Hebrew, they called it ezov. It grew in the cracks of limestone walls and along rocky terrain throughout the region. It was small, bushy, and aromatic. You could smell it before you saw it. Every household knew where to find it. But what makes this plant remarkable is not just that people used it. It is how consistently it appeared at moments of healing and cleansing across a span of more than 1,000 years of recorded history. In the book of Exodus, during the first Passover, the Israelites were instructed to take a branch of hyssop and use it to apply blood to their doorposts. The choice of hyssop was not random. It was the plant people already associated with protection and purification. In Leviticus, hyssop appears directly in the cleansing rituals for skin diseases. A priest overseeing the recovery of someone with a serious skin condition would use hyssop as part of the purification process. In Psalm 51, King David writes one of the most personal prayers in the entire Bible. He has done something he deeply regrets. He is asking for forgiveness and renewal, and the image he reaches for is this: "Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean." He did not say, "Wash me with water." He did not say, "Anoint me with oil." He specifically named this plant. And then in the Gospel of John, at the very end of Jesus' life on the cross, a soldier soaks a sponge in wine vinegar and lifts it up to Jesus' lips on a branch of hyssop. In the middle of an execution, someone reached for hyssop. For centuries, theologians focused on the spiritual meaning of those moments, but a growing number of researchers began asking a different question. What if the people living in those times chose hyssop specifically because of what it could do physically? The evidence that hyssop was valued medicinally, not just symbolically, comes from multiple ancient cultures. The Greeks used it. Hippocrates himself, the man credited as the father of Western medicine, mentioned hyssop in his writings as a treatment for respiratory conditions and chest infections. This is not a minor footnote. Hippocrates was deeply skeptical of superstition. When he wrote about a plant, he wrote about it because he had observed results. The Romans used it. Roman soldiers were known to carry dried hyssop on long campaigns. In a military culture obsessed with keeping armies functional, a plant that helped prevent wounds from going septic had obvious practical value. The Egyptians used it in preparations applied to the body during burial rites. Now, you might think that is purely ceremonial, but consider this. Egyptian embalmers were among the most sophisticated practitioners of preservation in the ancient world. They understood, through generations of observation, which natural substances resisted decay and which did not. The plants they chose for their most important rituals were not chosen at random. Archaeological excavations in Jordan and the broader Levant region have uncovered ceramic vessels containing residues of essential oils. Some of those residues have been chemically analyzed and match the profile of hyssop oil. These were not perfume bottles. They were storage containers used for practical purposes. The pattern across all of these cultures points to the same conclusion. People who lived close to the land, who paid careful attention to cause and effect over many generations, had independently identified this plant as something worth keeping close. Now here is where modern science steps in and begins explaining what ancient people observed but could not fully articulate. Hyssop produces a concentrated essential oil in its leaves and flowers. That oil contains several active compounds. The most significant are called pinocamphone and isopinocamphone. Think of those compounds this way. Bacterial cells have a protective outer membrane. It is like the wall of a house. If that wall holds, the bacteria survives, multiplies, and spreads. What the active compounds in hyssop oil do is attack that membrane directly. They break it down. They punch holes in it. Once that protective wall is compromised, the bacteria cannot maintain its internal environment. It dies. This is not a theory. This has been demonstrated in controlled laboratory settings using modern testing methods. The second way hyssop works involves fungi. Many skin infections in the ancient world were fungal, not bacterial. Hot climates, simple clothing, limited bathing facilities, all of these created ideal conditions for fungal overgrowth on the skin. Hyssop essential oil has demonstrated antifungal properties in laboratory testing as well. This explains why it appeared so consistently in skin purification rituals. The people performing those rituals may not have had the vocabulary to say antifungal or antibacterial, but they had something better, hundreds of years of watching what worked. The third mechanism involves inflammation. Hyssop contains natural compounds called flavonoids. You may have heard that word before in discussions of green tea or blueberries. Flavonoids help the body regulate its inflammatory response. When you get an infection, your immune system triggers inflammation in the affected area. That is a necessary defense, but it can also become excessive and cause additional damage. Compounds that modulate inflammation help the body fight back without turning the healing process into its own kind of injury. So in one small aromatic plant, you had something that attacked bacteria, fought fungal infection, and helped calm the body's inflammatory response simultaneously. The people of ancient Israel did not need a pharmacology degree to figure that out. They needed a grandmother who paid attention. Modern antibiotics are genuinely miraculous. Let us be absolutely clear about that. They have saved hundreds of millions of lives. The development of penicillin in the 20th century is one of the greatest achievements in human history. But in the year 2024, we are facing a problem that nobody fully anticipated when those antibiotics were first developed. The bacteria are fighting back. The World Health Organization has named antimicrobial resistance one of the top 10 global threats to human health. In the United States alone, more than 35,000 people die each year from infections caused by antibiotic-resistant bacteria. That number is climbing. Here is why this matters in relation to hyssop and plants like it. Modern antibiotics typically work by targeting one specific biological mechanism in a bacterium. The drug finds one lock and one key. The bacteria, under enough pressure, eventually evolve a different lock. The compounds in hyssop do not work that way. They attack multiple points simultaneously. It is much harder for a bacterium to evolve defenses against 5 different threats at the same time than against one. Several research teams have begun exploring whether plant-based compounds could serve as alternatives or supplements to conventional antibiotics, specifically for their ability to work against strains that have already developed drug resistance. The science is early. Nobody is suggesting you treat a serious infection with a cup of herbal tea instead of calling your doctor. That is not the point. The point is that we may have spent the last century dismissing an entire category of knowledge as primitive, when in fact, it was waiting to be properly understood. If this plant worked so well for so long, why did it fall out of common use? The answer involves several shifts that happened in a relatively short period of time, historically speaking. The first shift was the rise of industrial medicine. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, pharmaceutical chemistry made enormous leaps. Scientists learned how to isolate active compounds from plants, purify them, and synthesize them in laboratories. This was genuinely revolutionary. Suddenly you could produce a standardized dose of a medication, the same every single time, manufactured in bulk, distributed across the country. An herb harvested from a hillside in one season is different from the same herb harvested in a different season. A pill manufactured in a controlled facility is always identical. For medicine becoming a systematic discipline, standardization was not just convenient, it was essential. The second shift was cultural and economic. As professional medicine became institutionalized, the knowledge that existed outside institutions was gradually devalued. What could not be patented, mass-produced and sold at scale received no investment in research or promotion. A plant that grows wild on a hillside in Israel cannot be owned by a corporation, so no corporation had any incentive to fund studies on it, train doctors to recommend it, or advertise it on television. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply how markets operate. Investment follows profit potential. Profit potential requires exclusivity. Hyssop, like almost every traditional plant remedy, offered neither. The third shift was generational. The knowledge of medicinal plants lived in people, not books. It was passed from mother to daughter, from herbalist to apprentice, from village healer to the next generation. When industrialization pulled families off the land and into cities, when the role of the family physician replaced the village herbalist, those chains of transmission broke. Within 2 or 3 generations, knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years simply had no one left to carry it. Your great-grandmother likely knew the names of a dozen plants and what each one was good for. Most people today cannot name a single one. In 2019, researchers in Italy published a study examining the essential oil of hyssop against bacteria that had developed resistance to multiple conventional antibiotics. The results were significant. Hyssop oil showed measurable inhibitory activity, even against some of the strains that had already defeated standard pharmaceutical treatments. To understand why that matters, consider what MRSA is. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It is one of the most dangerous drug-resistant bacteria we currently face. It spreads easily, infects wounds, and kills people in hospitals every day. Every new antibiotic developed against it has eventually faced resistance. A plant that ancient healers were using to treat skin infections in 500 BCE is now being studied as a potential tool against one of the most difficult bacterial threats of the 21st century. There is also something quietly remarkable in the botany here. Hyssop belongs to the same plant family as rosemary and mint. Those 2 herbs sit in kitchens across America right now. People rub rosemary on chicken before roasting it. They brew mint into tea. They use both without thinking twice. The antimicrobial properties that made hyssop valuable in ancient Israel did not vanish. They are still present in the plants on your spice rack. The knowledge migrated into cooking and survived there, unrecognized, for 2,000 years. We are living through a renewed interest in what researchers now call ethnobotany. That is the systematic scientific study of how traditional cultures used plants and what those uses can teach modern medicine. Universities around the world are funding research programs dedicated to analyzing medicinal plants that appear in ancient texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Talmud, early Christian manuscripts, the writings of ancient Greek physicians. All of these are now being read not just as religious or historical documents, but as potential sources of pharmacological leads. For older Americans in particular, this conversation has a personal dimension. Many people over 60 grew up with grandparents or great-grandparents who still used home remedies, poultices made from plants, teas brewed for specific ailments, preparations that seemed like folk medicine at the time and were often dismissed by a younger generation that had grown up trusting the pharmacy more than the garden. Some of those preparations are now being validated by exactly the kind of rigorous scientific testing that previous generations said they lacked. The question worth sitting with is this: how much knowledge did we lose in the rush to modernize? How many effective tools did we set aside because they came from the wrong source, lacked a patent number, or could not be put into a capsule and sold? That knowledge is not entirely gone. It exists in old recipe books, in the memories of communities that maintained their traditions, in manuscripts and texts that are only now being analyzed with the tools to understand what they were actually describing. The researchers who are doing that work are not romantics chasing the past. They are scientists who recognize that 2,000 years of careful human observation is a data set worth taking seriously. At the beginning of this video, the question was simple. Why did the people of Jesus' time reach for hyssop when someone was sick? The answer turns out to be less mysterious than it seemed. They reached for it because it worked, not because of faith, not because of tradition alone, because generation after generation of careful, observant people noticed that wounds treated with hyssop healed better, that skin conditions improved, that the body recovered faster. They did not have the vocabulary of modern microbiology. They did not know about cell membranes or flavonoids or antifungal compounds, but they had something that is easy to underestimate. They had time, hundreds of generations of paying attention to the same plants in the same landscape. What science is doing now is not discovering something new. It is translating something very old into a language we can currently understand. And the larger lesson here is worth holding on to. The people who came before us were not primitive. They were solving the same problems we face with the tools available to them, and they were often remarkably good at it. Hyssop is one example, but it is part of a much larger story, a story about how much human knowledge can accumulate over thousands of years, and how quickly it can disappear when we stop paying attention to it, and how, if we are patient and curious enough, we can sometimes find it again. Hyssop is only the beginning of this conversation. Because if one plant mentioned in the Bible has demonstrable antibacterial properties confirmed by modern laboratory testing, the question naturally becomes what else is hiding in plain sight? The myrrh that the wise men brought to the infant Jesus. Ancient texts across multiple cultures describe it as a treatment for wounds and infections. Modern research has identified antimicrobial compounds in myrrh resin. The frankincense burned in temples across the ancient world for thousands of years. Scientists have identified anti-inflammatory compounds in its smoke. The olive oil that appears in anointing rituals throughout the New Testament. Medical researchers have published studies on its antimicrobial properties. One by one, the things the ancient world considered sacred are turning out to have been practical as well. In the next video, we are going to look at one of the most overlooked of all of them, a substance used in the wilderness for 40 years by an entire nation. Something so ordinary that most people have walked past it their entire lives without giving it a second thought, until you know what it contains.